Hi, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Ryan Streeter, director here at Civitas. Welcome back. Glad to have you here for this lunch talk on our speaker series. And I'm really delighted to be able to introduce Tim Carney to you here before. Here again, I was going to say, because Tim has been here before. When I was last at UT, I remember you came and spoke on our speaker series. It's great to have you back. But personally, I love having Tim here because we were colleagues at the American Enterprise Institute for almost 7 years before I came back to UT Austin. And I've always learned a lot from you, Tim, and in our conversations in the hallways at AEI and also from your written work and your books. For those of you who haven't followed Tim or met him, he's the author of, I think, is it 7 books now? Yeah, it's four books, 7 kids. Yeah, he's the author of 4 books, has 7 kids. And we're here to talk today about his latest book, Family Unfriendly, how our culture made raising kids much harder than it needs to be. Tim's a columnist at the Washington Examiner. If you're on Twitter, you've probably seen him there, and he writes about a lot of issues at the intersection of families, culture, politics, and a whole bunch of other stuff, and not just at the Examiner, but in a lot of the publications nationally that you would read. So we'll let him talk to you about why he wrote the book, what's in it, and then we'll open it up for questions like usual and have you out of here in the next hour or so. So Tim, welcome back to UT Austin. Good to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you, Ryan. Thank you, everybody, for coming and spending your lunch here. Ryan wasn't just my colleague. He was actually my boss at AEI. Boss at AEI is a funny term because we really do believe in academic freedom. We get to write on and research what we want to do. But also once Yuval Levin, who's now my boss, when I put boss in quotes and he heard it, he explained to me that while he never tells me what to do, he actually could fire me. And so Ryan never fired me, so thank you for that. And to be very clear, I was making a joke earlier. I do not have 7 kids. We have only 6 kids. I was just trying to make sense of that number there. So the day I first became a dad, I remember very clearly. It's one of those days, obviously, if you've been through it, you remember many of these moments very clearly. And one of them for me was my wife was asleep. We're in this maternity ward, overflow maternity ward, and I go out into the hallway where there's this makeshift nursery where my baby is, and there's just a few of us there in this overflow wing. And I remember the moment of staring down at this perfect, precious face and just looking at what is she going to look like when she's a toddler? Is she going to be a big sister to a lot of other people? Is she one day going to have kids? And while I'm thinking about all of these, the nurse informs me that my baby is about 3 bassinets down. I'm currently staring at somebody else's child. Sometimes I still wonder what happened to that kid. Maybe she'll be, in the freshman class here next year. But the point is, we were in this overflow room because in 2006, everybody was having babies. We hit 4.3 million babies in the United States in 2006, and every celebrity was having babies too. Tom Cruise and Katie Holmes, Surrey Holmes, she was born in 2006. Angelina Jolie and Brad Pitt, they had a baby then. Heidi Klum and Seal. By the way, if you use those names with undergrads, they might not know who either of those people are. But they all had babies. Gwen Stefani had a baby. Britney Spears had a baby. So then the next year in 2007, everybody followed on Brad Pitt, Tom Cruise, and me and had even more babies. The record number of babies born in America, more than any year in the baby boom, was 2007. And the birth rate was up, the total fertility rate was up above 2.1. And at that point, the millennials were just coming into their mid to late 20s, the biggest generation on earth right now. So we should have had a baby boom. The AP said we're having a baby boom late. The next baby boom is coming. It obviously didn't. Why? I mean, that's, I think, a great question. One reason that's obvious is the recession set in. And in the short term, recessions do drive down birth rates. But then we got out of the recession and the number of births kept falling and the birth rate kept falling. In 2019, right before the pandemic, we had in full employment, stock market at record highs. Everything was booming. And we fell from 4.3 down to 4.3 million babies down to 3.7 million babies in the U.S. And the birth rate had fallen from 2.1 total fertility rate down to 1.7. And now in the last 12 months, or last year, 2023, it was even lower than pandemic lows. So we are in a full-fledged baby bust. What does this mean? It means we have fewer children, not as a percentage, as a raw number, fewer children in America today. than we did at the last census. It means we have more people in their 60s than we have under the age 10 in the United States. So I think this is the most important story of the next 30 years. It also overlaps with something you guys might have heard about, an epidemic in childhood anxiety. So children are more anxious than ever before, and parents are stressed. So that's what I wrote Family Friendly about. So some people say, why is it bad? I've got economic reasons, and we can talk about those. Social Security, I say, is like the reflection on the cave wall of a deeper problem, which is that we will have fewer people to do productive work. The working age population is just about flatlined in the US. It used to be constantly rising, just about flatlined. And again, the baby bust is only about 16 years old, 17 years old. So 20 years from now, we'll be like Japan and Korea in that we will have a dropping working age population. Fewer people who could possibly do work. However much money you have saved up for retirement doesn't help you if nobody can come and fix your leaky pipes. Now, we have innovation, we have artificial intelligence. Maybe Google Gemini will take the place of the person you would have hired, but we don't know how that's going to turn out. Another reason it's bad. So number one is the economics about the dependency ratio in the 30 years when we have more and more retirees and fewer workers. Number two, women actually want babies. When asked the ideal family size, Americans, men and women, say more than 2. In fact, the average number has ticked up to 2.7. It's on the way up, while the birth rate is on its way down. And so let's address that. If we do want more kids, why aren't we having them? So here I tell a story. I went to Utah, which has a relatively high birth rate and actually relatively low childhood anxiety. They seem to be doing a lot of things right. But near the University of Utah, there's a neighborhood called the Avenues. The lower Avenues is different. Salt Lake City, I don't really like the shape of it. The streets are too wide, the blocks are too long. But in the lower Avenues, it's sort of shaped like a neighborhood should be shaped. But I walked around all day, and I didn't run into any kids. And finally, I ran into a couple, Nicole and Isaac. And they told me they didn't want kids. So the conversation went this way. We don't want kids, Nicole told me. Why not? We can't afford it, Nicole said. I pressed the couple on what makes kids so expensive. Everything, Isaac began. Healthcare. But honestly, it's just selfishness, he confessed. I joke with Nicole, some people are watching Teletubbies and cleaning up vomit, and we're going to be drinking margaritas in Paris. Moments later, a neighbor greeted the couple pushing a double stroller through the avenues. The passengers in the stroller were 2 chihuahuas. So later, I'm reeling from this experience. Well, one, the Children of Men scene with the no children and a stroller full of chihuahuas. 2, why would you go to Paris to drink margaritas? But number 3, those 2 reasons, we can't afford kids and we're too selfish. Those are the 2 most common reasons given for people not having kids. But they can't explain the change in the birth rate any more than Boeing could say, oh, well, those planes crashed because of gravity. No, there's got to be something to offset the gravity. There's got to be something to offset the selfishness. I'll get to that in a second. But the affordability, in the last 3 years, we've had a housing affordability crisis. That is a true economic deterrent from having kids. That's true. But the baby bust has been going on for 15 years. And the housing price thing hasn't been going on for that long. Housing prices were pretty good in 2014, and the birth rate was still much lower then than it was in 2007, 2006, when it was more expensive to have a house. And so what's going on? Also, affordability. There are economists who argue, Jeremy Horpedal is one who says that the number of weeks it takes the median male worker to afford a kid for a year has actually gone down. Gen Z, the millennials aren't actually poorer, according to the data I have in this book. Millennials aren't actually poorer than Gen X or the boomers at their given age. So economics can't do all the explanation. It can do some of the explanation, but it can't do all of it. And Melissa Carney, who I think was here, she spells her name differently than I do. She wrote a book called The Two-Parent Privilege recently, but she did a separate study about looking at state-by-state basis where sort of it becomes less affordable to raise kids. So compare that change to the change in the birth rate. She found no correlation between affordability changes and birth rate changes on a state level. So there's lots of evidence that, and also richer people don't really have more kids. When you get rich enough, and there's some people in this town, Elon Musk, he's got a lot of kids. We have no idea how many kids he has. By the way, I do not endorse that model of so that's why I don't call myself a pro-natalist. I try to say I'm pro-family. And family, singular family. So I think the economic explanation falls short. We can talk about that later. The selfishness falls short because if I had a chart, like an AEI chart of selfishness, I think it's at 0. Adam and Eve eat the fruit. It goes up to 100, and it's been flat since then. What we have, just like Boeing offsets gravity when they're doing their job right, culture offsets selfishness. Culture redirects the individual good, the individual incentives towards the common good. It aligns the short-term interests and the long-term interests. We're failing as a culture to do that, and that's why we're having fewer kids. Finally, so that means the most reasonable explanation for our birth dearth, our baby bust, is that our culture has changed. Another detail, the baby bust has trickled down from the upper middle class down to the middle class. That's what cultural trends tend to do. So who's been the exception in wealthy countries to the baby bust? Israel. This is a final data point for me that it's about culture, and we can talk about that a little bit later. But Israel is middle of the road on OECD countries as far as education, as far as wealth, as far as welfare state spending to support parents. It has a 3.0 birth rate. Secular Jews in Israel have 2.0. Europe's 1.5, and the US is 1.6, 1.7. So back to the reasons why the baby bust is bad. It reflects something unwell about our society. We're falling so short of our aspirations. The 2.7 ideal, or 2.2 is the intended family size on average, and we're having 1.7. So there's two shortfalls there. From the ideal to what we say, okay, well, this is what we're actually going to do, and then from what we intend to what we actually do. Those two shortfalls reflect a failure of our culture. This is especially true because we know that in some places and at some times, people do get closer to their intentions, and their intentions do more closely match their ideals. So it's bad because it reflects a sickness in our society. Also, finally, babies are good. People are happier when children are around. Society with more kids are more hopeful, more optimistic, and we need them. We need them not just to be the workers of tomorrow, but to be the people, to be the friends, to be the neighbors. And little people tend to make people happier. So, culture. How is our culture family unfriendly? Parenting culture. So, parenting culture is off the rails. We've replaced Little League with intensive, expensive travel sports. The amount of time that mom spends just taking care of kids, so not like doing a family outing, but like helping with homework or tying shoes or driving to a lacrosse tournament in Delaware, has gone up 50% since 1975. This is while dads have doubled the amount of time they put in, which is probably good. Women are working outside of the home a lot more, and families are smaller, yet parental inputs are increasing. And if you ask some of my friend Isabel Sawhill at Brookings Institution, says, well, this is good. This is progress. People are having smaller families and investing more in each kid. It is quality over quantity parenting, which obviously is implying that those of us with quantity are taking the opposite side of that deal. But I argue it's not actually quality parenting to helicopter your kids. It causes them to be anxious. It ruins your family culture to be driving to lacrosse tournaments every weekend. It deprives your kids of independence to not let them wander the neighborhood. And it makes them think that the point of high school, for instance, is to get into a good college. Well, high school should be a good in itself. The point of youth baseball is to climb up the ladder and make the varsity team and get a D1 scholarship. No, Little League should be a good in itself. So quality over quantity is part of the bad culture. The other part of our culture that's broken is mating and dating culture. People don't get married in their 20s anymore. And again, you'll be told this is a good thing. Oh, it's because they're finishing their greater education and they're more mature when they get married. And yes, divorce rates have fallen because, I would say, of a postponement in marriage. But at the same time, the happy planning story for kids 15 years ago, people said, oh, it looks like you're having fewer kids just because people are having them later. And yes, the number of women who have babies in their late 30s is way up. But on the end, we are having fewer kids. More women are ending their childbearing years with fewer kids than they wanted compared to 20 years ago. So mating and dating culture is broken. I think it's because of a variety of things, but the easy one to start with is the apps. So the dating apps are supposed to make it easier, right? They get past that, like, well, he might be halfway across town and I just never bump into him problem. They get past, well, does he like me? Does, et cetera, problem that we used to use passing notes to the girl in the middle row in 4th grade. And, do you like Susie? Do you like Tommy? But that double secret consent being sort of technified, I think poisons the brain. There's now, I saw a poll, 1 in 6 young women said it would be sexual harassment to be asked out by somebody they didn't want to be asked out by. Now, of course, how do you know? Well, you know because you have double secret consent on the apps. But to do it in person, well, that would be an abuse. One guy said, Kate Julian wrote about a student named Simon. He was interested in a girl on his volleyball team. He wanted to ask her out, but he concluded it would be incredibly awkward or even boorish to ask this girl out because she was on the volleyball team. They had met through something that wasn't explicitly set up for dating. Now, when I talk to students, I say, if you're on a co-ed volleyball team, the point is to meet somebody of the opposite sex. The point is not the volleyball. But it's made this mindset that you have to be explicitly in a place, in a cyber virtual space for dating to ask somebody out. Dating within friend groups is considered verboten because if it goes wrong, it would ruin stuff. But there's a deeper problem here, and it involves a deification of autonomy, and this is at the root of our family unfriendly culture. So another excerpt. I don't do relationships, explains Jesse, my bartender in Greenville, South Carolina. Jesse brags that he has risen above his, quote, ultra-conservative Southern Baptist upbringing with its traditionalist sexual mores. I'm a feminist, he explains. These are connected for Jesse. In his romantic life, which flows from the apps or from his clientele at the college bar, he explains, I'm honest. I don't really do dating. There are a lot of women who are into that because they've all been in possessive relationships. Possessive, after all, is the opposite of liberating. Christine Emba, a millennial author who wrote an excellent book called Rethinking Sex, explains, the sexual revolution was fought on the belief that, quote, to achieve the ideal sexual world that we desire, we need to realize freedom more completely. By freedom, we mean more privacy, more space, less connection, less constraint. And so that idea, first of all, it hasn't had the results we think. There's less sex, less dating, less marriage because of the sexual revolution in recent years. But that less connection is the goal. That's related to this worship of autonomy. And I write, you can see why this liberated, unconstrained, modern approach to sex, dating, and marriage, known as hookup culture since the late 1990s, would be fun for guys like Jesse, who assures me that he has an adequate supply of females for non-committal sex. How is it working out for everyone else? I think what you see when you ask that question is a real sadness, a delay in marriage, an aversion to dating, an aversion to connection and commitment. And this points at the last most important thing. Our culture's values are family unfriendly. Autonomy and consent are the dominant values, and they become almost the only values of our day. In such a culture, kids are just one more lifestyle choice, like having a boat. My dear friend John Drogan is sitting in the back. If he had a boat and was my neighbor, I'd help him with it a couple times, but eventually I'd be like, dude, you bought a boat. You knew you were taking on a big burden. That's kind of your problem. Well, that's how we think of kids now. Stephanie Murray, a great parenting writer, writes that once having a kid went from kind of being what you do, people grow up, you finish school, you get married, you have kids. You can opt out of that, but it's what you do. We don't do that anymore. Now it's agonized over, it's postponed. It's part of intentional living as you're going to plan at this point to have a kid. Not only does that increase the pressure and lead to this high intensity parenting, it also makes it seem like, well, now it's your choice, it's your problem. Ron Johnson, the Republican senator, when he was discussing tax credit for families, said, I've never thought that it was society's job to help people raise their children. Again, remember Christine Emba's words. By freedom, we mean more privacy, more space, less connection, less constraint. This is like bartender Jesse's approach. No relations. Everything's just transactions. As one liberal friend of mine put it, mocking some of his friends, he said, they consider themselves to all be free-floating, atomized bundles of rights bouncing around the universe like a Cartesian billiard ball. When autonomy becomes our lodestar, I think loneliness becomes our default condition. And if this sounds sad, it is sad. And that sadness is the heart of the baby bust. So my last chapter is titled Civilizational Sadness. And I quote people like Miley Cyrus, who replaced Gwen Stefani as a guest host on The Voice and was a Musician of the Year in 2014 when birth rates were falling to record lows, who said, we're getting handed a piece of crap planet, and none of us millennials are going to have kids until we're confident there's going to be fish in the water. He said, we're not going to have kids because the earth can't handle it. So part of the idea is that we're overpopulated, which I hope everybody now realizes is absurd. But when I was a kid, there was an article in the New York Times that was saying, we need to teach kids about the problem of overpopulation. It was illustrated with a swarm of rabbits eating the earth, which was a big head of cabbage. And the message was, it's sort of a dark message, but we need to tell children that children are bad for the planet. The guy who wrote this was a principal of a public elementary school in New Milford, Connecticut, the John Pettibone School. I went and visited the John Pettibone School. It closed in 2014 due to low and falling enrollment. When I was there was senior yoga and a dog park outside. So his message worked. And it worked with people like Miley Cyrus. He says, we're not having kids because the earth can't handle it. What is it? It is kids. But it's not just kids. It's humans. It's us. The earth can't handle us. I think that we see ourselves as a culture as bad. One woman, Amanda, told me, do I think humans are good? No. We're the cancer of the earth. So I don't think we are the cancer of the earth. I think we're actually good. Humans make us better. Human poverty has fallen. The number of people in poverty has been falling for hundreds of years. The percentage of people in poverty has been falling for many hundreds of years. Generally, human life gets better if you look over a long arc of history. Who's making it better? Is it Google Gemini? Is it climate change? Is it space aliens or lizard people? No, humans are making life better. Some humans are making life worse. Who's that American League umpire, Angel Hernandez? He's making life worse. But on average, the expected value, to put it in economist terms, the expected value of every human being is positive. But the most important one I find is that kids make us better, make us as parents and non-parents better. I'm a Christian, and the Bible says to feed the hungry and clothe the naked. I wake up in the morning, there are hungry, naked people right there in my house. They're right there. It is a cheat code for virtue to be raising kids. Some of you are my age, so you'll know what, I might get it wrong. Up, up, down, down, left, right, A, B, A, B. Sorry. The Konami code. It was a cheat code for a video game to get extra lives and extra power. That's what I think parenting is. And even uncling is that as well. You just become less selfish when you are around kids. So does selfishness cause us to have fewer kids? Yes, kind of. Does having fewer kids make us more selfish? Yes. So I'm just going to end with a quick excerpt and jump into questions. The excerpt is from the end of the book. Mrs. Anastasia was a preschool teacher who taught 5 of our kids. She helped bring us into the Catholic parish where we were for 15 years. St. Andrews. St. Andrews defined our life. If you read my last book, Alienated America, it sort of starts and ends there. This book kind of starts and ends there too. We've left for Virginia now. But on the last week of school, the last week that she was teaching one of our kids, she wrote an email, says, I'm not going to be here on the very last day. So I write, we owed Mrs. Anastasia the grandest of all last day of school teacher presents. But with her early start to summer vacation, we didn't have time to get anything. And so on the next morning, her last day teaching a Carney kid, I brought her the only thing I could, my kids. Mrs. Anastasia opened the door at 7:35 to the gift of Eve, Sean, Meg, Brendan, and Charlie, all beaming. She cried and hugged my crew, her crew. It's common to mock parents for believing their child is God's gift to the world, but very literally, Children are God's gifts to us. My children are gifts to others, not because my children are special, but because my children are children. Humans are good. That truth is obscured at times by our own self-absorption or by others' imperfections, but children, in their innocence, reflect mankind's innate goodness back to us. In one of Charles Dickens' stories about human wretchedness, the protagonist is a kind and generous child named Nell. The narrator, an old man who wanders London alone, runs into Nell when she is lost and in need of help. This guileless cherub gives him her trust and friendship, and so instantly cheers and inspires the old man in a way almost any reader would instantly understand. I love these little people, the narrator says, and it is not a slight thing when they who are so fresh from God love us. As I had felt pleased by her confidence, I determined to deserve it. I still get that feeling, even after 17 years, and even when, again and again, I fail to deserve it. It's easy to believe these days that we're not good, but the love of a little one can remind us that we are good. Could you be better? Yes. But nothing is going to inspire you more to be better than taking on this burden of love of raising children. So I hope that our culture inspires people more to do that. We turn around the baby bus and the child anxiety by building a family-friendly culture. Thank you.
Thank you for your presentation. I have two questions. One is the last chapter you talked about civilizational sadness. And I was wondering, you brought up Israel as an example of a Western country that has a high birth rate. And I was wondering if part of the civilizational, quote unquote, problem or unfriendliness towards family is the general thought in Europe and America that our nations and their cultures and histories are bad and not worth perpetuating. So beyond the climate change, the earth can handle us, there's also this thought, I don't want to make more Americans, I don't want to make more Frenchmen. We're evil, we ruined the world, we colonized, destroyed, pillaged, and raped.
I absolutely think that's true. I can't prove that, but I dedicate stuff in the last chapter to evidence arguing that idea. The question is, are we good? Now, what do you mean by we? Some people mean the human race, but you might mean Frenchmen, you might mean New Yorkers, you might mean white people, you might mean Europeans. So a couple bits of evidence. Where the baby bus in Europe started last century was Germany and Italy, and Japan was the other of the three lowest countries. I remember when I saw that jumped out at me as maybe meaning something. The Germans, it took them a while to come to terms with the fact that, this wasn't one evil German. This was the whole country. It was they bore this as a guilt. And they couldn't say we're good. They couldn't say we need more of this. I have a friend who recently did 23andMe. When he found out he was German, he told this to his friend who's from Germany. And the friend instantly, without his face dropped, and he said, "Oh, I'm sorry." It's a racial guilt that's, based on the fact that they did the most evil thing that we know of people doing in the last few hundred years. And is that trickling into the broader Western society? I think so. And the broader wealthy society, I should say. I think you need a different explanation for the racial guilt. I mean, not the racial guilt, the civilizational sadness in Asia, but we can talk about that later. But think about the baby boom in the US. The baby boom was not a makeup for the babies that didn't happen during the war. It was a massive, unprecedented, generation-long increase in marriage, increase in family size. Demographers didn't think that was possible. Lots of reasons it happened. I think one reason, men got off the boat and they just defeated two evil empires. And the women were on the dock and they just kept the economy running, building all these machines for 4 years. So they smooch on the pier, get married at the chapel, go home and have a ton of babies, because never before, never since have we known so clearly that we are good. So I do think that, and that's why I use the term civilizational sadness. I also use it as the argument because if I'm talking about culture, I know that the culture in Korea and the culture in Germany and the culture in Southern Europe are very different, and they're all having demographically similar things. There's lots of overlap. Technology is a whole chapter here, the smartphones, et cetera. But also the spirit of the modern age permeates all of them, and it is that worship of autonomy, and that inevitably makes us sad because it deprives us of connection.
I think you said in 2006 there was record numbers of stadiums.
2006 and 7 was the highest.
So I'm wondering, because I mean, it's not like the culture was that different then than it is post 2000. So it just strikes me as I'm really persuaded by your argument, except that I can't make sense of that blip right there that's different than what came after.
Well, one thing that I learned after I wrote the book, because my daughter was making fun of, my oldest was making fun of the boy right below her, and she said, "When exactly did births start falling? Was it because of Charlie?" And she could argue that it was, because the summer of, 2008, mid to late 2008, was when the number of last 12 months births started its consistent drop. So, but I don't think it's because of Charlie. It is interesting that that's a little over a year after the first smartphone, the first iPhone came out. Also, I do think culture has changed significantly for the more negative, the more autonomy worshiping, the less communal since then. But also birth rates had been generally low. So Gen X, we carried our weight. We had about a replacement level birth rate, but generally they had gone and they were flat for years up until 2006. And so the total fertility rate, which shouldn't take any other demographic noise into account, should clear all of that out, had been relatively flat up until that point. So one explanation for me is that the Great Recession introduced an idea of precarity that was an economic idea, but not simply economic. That really drove home the idea of sort of like every man for himself. It's a fixed pie that we're fighting over, that sort of thing. So when the millennials were graduating college, they were graduating into this idea of precarity. So when I say it's cultural, I don't mean to say economics doesn't have a role. I say if you want to understand the role of economics, you should understand it through culture.
I introduced myself at the beginning. I run an institute that has family in its name. So I'm very grateful for a talk like this and for a book like this. The question is one that usually starts a lot of interviews on books, and like who the book is, who's this book for? And the reason I ask this is that I have the impression that there are a significant number of scholars and even young people interested in the family and like very aware of what are all the cultural factors affecting it. And then there are some old parents that are very aware of. But I have the fear and the impression and the fear that the young parents of the one child are the ones that are not, that need this message. And I wonder if, is this book gonna help them understand how to not be helicoptering, how to,
Thank you. So I ended up moving the stuff about travel sports, over programming, and helicoptering, and then sort of basic kind of policy changes needed about walkability, et cetera, up to the front, in part because I was afraid demographics would bore people in the beginning. That was originally how I started it. In part because I wanted a accessible entry point before I got to deeper philosophical things and tougher policy questions, but in part because I thought if somebody gives you this book and you have a baby, there's a good chance you're not going to make it past chapter 2. So I wanted to make sure I put the sort of parenting advice up front. And so, yes, chapter 1 is titled Have Lower Ambitions for Your Kids. Now, obviously, that's kind of a joke. Again, I'm a Catholic. My ambition is that my children become saints. In secular terms, that they become men and women of virtue, that they have happy adulthoods and happy childhoods. But getting into Princeton is not one of the ambitions we've ever had. The point of sports is sports. Like when my son is playing JV baseball, I conditioned myself finally, after being a bad sports parent to being a good one, of just saying, this is beautiful in and of itself. Like when he hits a double, I'm not thinking, oh, that should get him moved up in the batting order and then he'll make the varsity squad. I'm just thinking, that was awesome. He just hit a bomb. And so that is up front. So yes, one of the audiences is parents to say, you need to chill. You need to, and one of the distinctions I make is between a child-centric family and a family-centric family. I remember when I was, and this was 40 years ago, I was babysitting this one kid, and I called and I got their answering machine. Remember those house line, landline answering machine? And the voice message was all about, the greeting was all about the kids. You've reached the home of Zach, the Lego maniac. I'm saying, this is just Zach's house. The one child, high intensive parenting, you get like a little God. And that's something that's always existed. My old boss, Bob Novak, was an only child, and he grew up in a Jewish family, and his cousins would call him the baby Jesus because as an only child, he was just like gushed over. And so now that's what high intensity parenting is. And so, yeah, like, what do I hope with this book? A, I hope that it would be a bestseller and my wife and I would be able to buy a house in Virginia. That didn't happen. B, there's policy changes I want to see, but the real hope would be like a 2025 baby boom. That people who have one kid and think they can't have any more would say, you know what, we can. We're going to immerse ourselves in a community. One of the middle chapters is called It Takes a Village. So that would be the other advice that I give. That's often the last question on a radio show. What advice would you give parents? Move to a place, immerse yourself in a school, a church, something that's going to be the village that it takes to raise that child.
Thanks so much for your talk. And I have a question somewhat similar to David's earlier, but I wanted to ask about how your message reaches the Miley Cyrus types, and not specifically those who, there are some people who worry, overpopulation, et cetera, whatever. But the thing that I feel like I've heard more prevalently amongst some liberal friends my age is that climate change is going to make the world so it's a shit place to live, essentially.
Yeah.
And that polarization as well is awful. And so it's just not moral to bring a new child into this world. How does your message reach people who are so convinced of those things?
Well, so I have two answers for that. The first is that, so when I write, I always have sort of readers, editors, critics in my mind, and I try to address some of their criticisms. And then at some point, some people I just think, you're just too far gone. I'm not trying to persuade Miley Cyrus, as you say. With my last book, I knew some people who were legitimately Rousseauians who just, again, they thought, well, any culture, society is just poisoning your true self. And at some point, I just realized I just need to throw them out the window. And I'll try to read the relevant parts of this excerpt. Your kids are not doomed was the startling headline above a 2022 New York Times story by liberal writer Ezra Klein. He felt he had to say it because the most frequent question he gets asked at speeches during dinner parties and from podcast listeners is, should I have kids given this climate crisis? First of all, I say that's an evidence of sadness that people are looking for, life advice from their favorite wonk blogger. But Klein had a good answer. He would observe a telling fact. Climate scientists and climate activists keep having kids. Why? Quotes one saying, I unequivocally reject, scientifically and personally, the notion that children are somehow doomed to an unhappy life. What looks like an apocalypse in prospect often feels more like grim normality when it arrives in the present. Klein got more precise. The people, like Miley Cyrus, saying they couldn't bear handing a burning, flooded, poisoned world to their kids are disproportionately rich people in the world's richest country. These are precisely the people who are least harmed by climate change and most capable of adaptations. What's more, even if climate change makes human life worse than it would have been, it's madness to conclude that human life over the next century will be worse than it has been in past centuries. Plagues, pestilence, war, crime, violence have all been far worse through most of human history than they are now, when people were more prone and more wanting to have family. Even the dourest climate alarmist paints a picture of human life in 2100 that is far healthier and far happier than most of the past 10,000 years. The other totems of dread also don't hold up, I argue. Racism is lower than it was at almost any point in human history, et cetera. So why do wealthy Western liberals spend so much time expressing these fears? You could be uncharitable and say, oh, they just want to play video games and this is an excuse, but I don't like being uncharitable for that. Ezra Klein's explanation is skeptical but generous. The fear about the future our children will face, when voiced by well-off residents of wealthy countries, sometimes strikes me as a transference of guilt into terror. The guilt here is guilt that we, in this case, the well-off residents of wealthy countries, through our consumption and lifestyle, have poisoned the planet in a way that will make it miserable for others. I argue that climate change is a totem of dread. Dread is a cover story for guilt, and the climate guilt is a totem for a broader guilt. So what I try to do, again, walk them through this story that explains, A, parenting can be easier and it should be easier. B, admits if you do it, it will be the hardest thing you ever do. But C, again, it will make you better. And so that is the people who have been hearing that message for their whole 20 years of life. What I'm trying, some of them haven't fully bought into it. It kind of hangs over them. And so I do think some of them I can pull away. And this is sort of the art of a writer, right? One of my friends said, in the last chapter, you argue that if you want to be a man or a woman of virtue, this is the path. And he says, but how are you going to convince them that they should care about virtue? I said, well, hopefully by the end of 300 pages, they like me enough that it just sounds like a good idea. There's certain things that you can't rationally persuade people of.
First off, you were talking about the growth of like travel ball compared to Little League. Mm-hmm. Just one quick tidbit on that before I get to my question. I was watching actually an MLB game a couple days ago, and the announcers were talking about how travel ball schedules can now work upwards of like 80 and 120 games in a season, and that was like the most flabbergasting thing I've heard anytime recently.
That's wild.
120 games for like 10-year-olds.
Yeah.
And we wonder why pitchers are getting injured at record rates. Anyways, getting back to this topic, you've mentioned it a couple times in this talk, and I know last time I heard you speak several years ago, you got into it a little bit more in terms of how we build our physical spaces, neighborhoods, walkability, that sort of thing. I've always been sort of interested on those areas in terms of much more kind of conventional economics. Just it's a misallocation of capital. It's raises housing costs. It's just bad financial decision making. But do you want to elaborate on kind of the social capital aspects of that? And obviously the it does have an economic impact across the entire country.
Yes. So chapter 3 is my favorite chapter title. It's if you want fecundity in the sheets, you need walkability in the streets. And so I remember reading William F. Buckley saying you should always use a word that people have to look up. And so a lot of people do have to look up fecundity. But that walkability, I remember living on Capitol Hill and thinking there was a guy running for city council in D.C. and he said for a more walkable district. And I just thought, what is walkability? Like, this is some weird liberal obsession. And then I realized I took it for granted. I lived on Capitol Hill. I came from a relatively wealthy town in Westchester County where I could walk and ride my bike everywhere. And then we started raising our kids in Wheaton, Maryland, where there's 3 lanes of traffic in either direction. And I'm like, Katie, they're 8. They can walk to the grocery store that we can see from our house. And then she says, they can't. Look how they would have to sprint across the street and hope that nobody's taking a right turn just to make it on time. There's no sidewalk on all the way down that block, and there's no sidewalk at our current house. Children need to roam freely. And so that's part of what, for their own good and for parents' good, for the neighborhood's good. And so sidewalks, crosswalks, there needs to be playgrounds within walking distance. There needs to be downtowns where they can get jobs within biking distance. And then there's a question of sort of zoning and density. The problem with the zoning density conversation now is that it's the YIMBY urbanists all are weird. They'll post a picture of some giant 14-story apartment building in Houston next to these townhouses and just say, isn't that beautiful? No, it's not. It's ugly. I'm not saying you shouldn't be allowed to have more density, but I'm saying that's an ugly building. Stop being so weird. And they don't think about kids. So Tall apartment buildings, I don't think are family friendly. There's no evidence that that sort of density actually drives up birth rates. It actually drives it down, is what it looks like. People aren't asking the questions in a nuanced, detailed enough way. And that's the next study I would do if I were to write a book that, I mean, I could try to come up with a popular title for it. And again, but the one I'm thinking of is just urbanism for non-weirdos, but for urbanism for families. And it would be, okay, I don't think tall apartment buildings are more family friendly, but we need more density because we need more houses, because high housing prices is the economic factor that really drives down birth rates. And so is it garden apartments? I don't know. What sort of density combined with what sort of walkability and bikeability reduces childhood anxiety, increases birth rates? That's a question that really needs more exploration. And the people, the NIMBYs and the YIMBYs both basically they don't ask that question.
Great. I found this super insightful. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm interested in what you think about the fact that this birth dearth seems to be cross-cultural. So I think something like 2/3 of people around the world live in a society with below replacement fertility. India is either at replacement or
they're at like 2.0. Yeah.
And my sense is their culture is quite different still. And so, anyway, I'd be interested in any thoughts on how that relates to your.
So again, that's how I, one of the reasons I talk about the sadness. But another thing is across cultures and almost without exception, and maybe without exception, religiosity predicts birth rates, and so secularization is a common force across the country. I think Lyman Stone, who's like either he or places he pointed me to are like 10% of the footnotes in this book. I think he says that for Buddhists, religiosity is inversely correlated with fertility, but for everybody else, religiosity, which in Christianity and Judaism and Islam at least, it means attendance. And in India, for instance, there are 2 provinces or states that are way above replacement, and they are the most Hindu and the most Muslim provinces. And they're, I think, both above 3. And so secularization, which I don't equate secularization with civilizational sadness, but I think they're causally connected in both ways, and they certainly overlap a lot. So that would be a common thread. But also, I think you could, if you wanted to do a more international treatment along these lines, I think that the workism of Northern Europe is a sadness that drives down birth rates. And I don't know what to call it without being offensive. Let me put it this way. Nobody, when you think about Italy and Spain, nobody ever used the phrase Catholic work ethic. So the opposite is a sadness in Southern Europe that leads to a sense of pointlessness. And both of those are present in the U.S. in the same way. There's a sort of feminist workism that I write about in here. There's a elite workism that I write about in here. And then for the working class, there's a sense of pointlessness. Working class guys who can't find a good job. And if they have a kid, they're not married to the mother. So they're different sorts of sadness. But I do think that they are tied to a sense of a lack of a sense of meaning and purpose, either toiling at something that seems ultimately unrewarding or a lack of feeling needed.
I had a question regarding the influence of immigration. I was just thinking about this recently, and is it possible that people didn't realize that, they talk about things being overpopulated, birth rates declining, but population continuing to grow in the United States and some other countries as well. Do you think that is possibility that it masked what was happening? Because people still see, like, there's just as many people, if not more, from what I've seen before, but they're not realizing that, they're in their 50s and 60s. They're not 10, 11, 12 years old right now.
I think there's a lot going on there. First of all, you come to Austin and you say overpopulation isn't a problem, and people might roll their eyes at you, but actually Austin seems to be exceptional at actually building housing to in the last couple of years to match the influx. But you could see immigration interacts with this whole story in a lot of different ways. You could say it's saving us. The reason our workforce isn't dropping is entirely because of immigration. We would have a falling working age population if it weren't for immigration. And immigrants, unlike babies, often can start working on day one, because a lot of them it gets called in parts of the media military age men, which means working age men, prime working age men. But also, yes, it could be it's not a fix. And again, Isabel Sawhill, my last book, Alienated America, like, she was one of the heroes, and I feel bad that she keeps coming up as one of the villains here, but I wanted to find somebody arguing that we don't need more babies, we need more immigrants, and I found an Isabel Sawhill article headlined, "We don't need more babies, we need more immigrants." And that's wrong for 100 reasons. One of the reasons is our top 3 sources of immigration, China, India, and Mexico, all have sub-replacement. It can only be a patch, and it's probably the reason why Europe has been worrying about falling birth rates for 10 years. We started like a year ago worrying about this, and it's probably because we are, I would say, blessed with immigration. One of the complicated things I don't get into but deserves to be talked about is immigration drives down wages for low-skilled men. It can drive down wages for low-skilled men, I would say. And so lack of marriageability for working-class men who finished high school and that was it, or at least didn't finish college, that will delay and possibly prevent family formation. So, there's arguments you could be, immigration is good for the whole economy, I believe, but is it bad for a subset that is particularly vulnerable to not getting on that family train? So there's lots of interesting complications there.
Question along the same lines. I had heard that in the numbers you're talking about, in fact, reflect the fact that Latin American immigrants Latin American women immigrants were in fact the drivers of keeping us at 2 for about 20 years. But after 2006, assimilation kicked in. And so it wasn't that the whole culture changed. Mm-hmm. It's that we no longer can rely upon the fertility of people coming from Latin America, which no longer have the fertile culture they once had.
So a lot of interesting composition effects in demographics. I don't know if it's true that sort of second generation, if you say what was a birth rate of second generation Hispanic immigrants, in 2005 compared to today, is that different? First generation, I don't know. First generation higher birth rates is almost all explained, I believe, by higher religiosity. And then the other, the fastest drop in birth rates of a demographic group is among Hispanic women. It's coming from a higher base, so it's easier for it to drop faster. B, more Hispanic women are second generation and third generation than used to be. C, assimilation kicks in, and if it does, that's another reason to think about the smartphones and the social media, these flattening tools that flatten cultural differences. I actually really believe U.S. needs lots of cultural differences. I hate the idea of a melting pot. Call it a mosaic, call it whatever. We need to have sort of Polish neighborhoods and Salvadoran neighborhoods and that sort of thing. And that flattening the cultural differences, I think, ends up being a negative force. Another thing is liberal women have always had fewer babies. Not always. Liberal women for a generation have had fewer babies than conservative women. And 20-something women are more liberal now. A higher portion of 20-something women are liberal now. So that itself could explain a huge part of the demographic shift is the secularization and the liberalization of white women, just changing the composition of the electorate.
Yeah, I found it very interesting what you said about kind of, modern dating culture. I recently read The Case Against the Sexual Revolution, and I think the author makes like some, very similar arguments. And I guess I'm also the age where I've experienced like some of the, disadvantages of the new dating culture. But I guess on the other hand, there are also like a lot of advantages, right? And it's kind of like gone along with like lots of advances in like gender equality that I guess we don't really want to take back. And and also like, I don't know, I also wouldn't have wanted to marry my first boyfriend, for example, right? Mm-hmm. Like there's also like and that would probably happen more often in a different culture. So there is also like obviously lots of advantages to having more choice, like thinking more carefully about who you want to be with for the rest of your life, instead of kind of like culturally being like nudged in the direction of like, oh, you just get married at 20 or whatever. So yeah, I'm kind of wondering what your thoughts are on like what a different culture could actually look like that probably is like, we're probably not going to go back to how it was like 50 years ago, right? Like kind of how can we go forward and keep some of the advantages while like making like marriage like something that people think more positively about again?
And that's a great question. And I do talk to people who earnestly say more arranged marriages would be good. I don't advocate that in the book. So virtue is a mean. The some level of, but it's impossible to mix if you take autonomy and consent to sort of be on the individual level with regard to particular actions, that's an unalloyed good. But when it becomes a broader philosophy, that's when you get allergic to any sort of attachment. Because one young woman came up to me and said, I would love to have a family, but if I got married and have kids, just having kids would require my stepping out of the workforce for at least a little bit. My earning power would then be, over the long run, harmed. And if my marriage fell apart, I would be in worse shape. So she wants to be a mother, but this sort of almost a financial insurance product is the argument against doing this truly meaningful thing that she wants to do. And so, again, to me, that's a sad argument. How do we build this? So again, what I'll say about the dating apps, what's wrong with them is that they create, one of the things wrong with them is they create this idea of there's an infinite number of women out there. So, and men, why would I settle? One woman told me she became so perfectionist because you can't judge a person really by their profile that she would be like, why would I go for a guy who is slightly bald? That guy, he says he's 5'10", but he looks shorter in the picture. And so that's a problem as well. I think there's no way to have a good, healthy dating, mating culture without just strong communities, human-level institutions that bring us together. I mean, this is one of the reasons you've seen multiple articles recently about actually meeting your spouse in college is probably a good idea, in part because you have a bunch of people. You get to hang out with them. As one guy put it about my generation, he said, you guys browsed, we search. Browsing is a superior way to meet your spouse, I would think, because rationally we think we have these checklists, and then what we end up wanting ends up being a little different than what we think we want. And browsing also means you have a connection, you have common friends, you have common institutions. So my last book was about the collapse of community and belonging and institutions of civil society. I think a healthy dating culture has to be more oriented around those institutions of civil society, which will mean, you're going to have a smaller pool of men to draw from instead of every man in the world who's on Tinder or Bumble, but but ideally with women's greater earning potential, there's as many women working now as there are men in America. The employed workforce is 49.9% women. Women are, as you guys all know, a vast majority of college graduates and master's degree recipients, et cetera. So that takes away a lot of the economic sort of need to get married, but I would hope that the urge to be there to start a family would still be there. And I would just say it's got to be done in communities. And the communities are going to be the ones that are going to enforce the norms. One thing I found out that Christianity actually had a downward effect on birth rates at first because it prescribed monogamy, it counseled against premarital sex, and it prescribed you have to take care of your kids. All three of those things are antinatal. I mean, probably the red-pilled Elon Musk fans think this is an argument against Christianity. So again, that's sort of virtue being a mean somewhere in the middle. It's got to be enforced. It's got to be done in communities that enforce norms of consent and equality.
I have one last question about the culture aspect of your argument, which is, what do you think is the effect of the changing norms regarding, or the changing way in which we understand marriage on child rearing? And by this, I mean marriage used to be about the family, and now it's about love and you and me. And I choose you and you choose me. And it seems to me that a marriage based on love and feeling and mutual choice and commitment to one another almost necessarily makes it less about the family and less about the kids. And I haven't heard you talk about this.
Yes.
I was wondering if you had thoughts.
There's this trend in the media to use the word partner to replace husband, wife, boyfriend, girlfriend, fiance, whatever, partner. And a partnership is what's going on. And it has this sort of horrible business-like connotation to me. But it's this all-leveling desire of the spirit of the day in the modern media. And that idea that it's a partnership, and it's cute when people are like, oh, I'm marrying my best friend, it's great. And I don't have any objection to that, but the partnership is the one that I think of, okay, yeah, it's a partnership. Yes, it's a team. But if it sounds like a business partnership, that also makes it dissolvable at any point too, right? And if it's about, I mentioned Brad Pitt and Angelina Jolie, but Brad Pitt and Jennifer Aniston, when he left her, he said, well, we always agreed that we were together because we were mutually benefiting from it. And once we didn't feel we were mutually benefiting from it, we were going to break it apart. So that idea of contingency, that transactions replace relations, that is obviously not just not building stable marriages for kids to be raised in, but also cuts against having kids. Because you don't get to opt out of being their parent at some point. It's not like, 3-year contract and then an option for a 4th year, like NBA contract. And also, one of the lines I have in here, quoting a writer, Charles Fane Lehman, I say, every single child born was unchosen. Because you might have chosen to have a child, but you didn't choose this one. So one last anecdote. I started with a story about when my daughter was like 8 hours old. When she was actually born, like that first moment, there's a million emotions going on. But when the baby was handed to my wife, Katie just goes, she looks at me, her eyes bigger than they've ever been before. And she goes, Tim. And the message she was conveying was, what are we doing? What do we do now? And who is this person? Think about it. We'd known she was a girl for 7 months. We had named her Lucy. We had hung the Lucy stuff on the wall. We'd been singing like Irish rebel songs as lullabies to her. But then she comes into the room and she's a total stranger. We had never met her before. So that's why it's okay that I didn't recognize her a few hours later. But having a kid is just signing yourself, is throwing out the window the idea that you can plan anything. And it's throwing out the idea that you're going to consent to everything. It's embracing unchosen obligations. Even if you chose to have this child, you are accepting unchosen obligations. That cuts against the modern spirit. But again, I would argue it makes us happier. One last question.
In a way, this is a follow-up on what you were just saying. At first, I really enjoyed this. I thought this was really fantastic. This is still a little ill-formed, but I was wondering if you could tell us a bit more about the part of the story that we're becoming more selfish, and that this is part of what's driving this decrease in birth rates. And if I understood this part of your talk, you were basically suggesting we have these cultural obsessions with consent and autonomy and these like classical liberal notions, and that this is causing us to become more selfish. And I was wondering what you meant by autonomy, and I came up with this gloss. I'm not sure if this is right, but basically it comes down to the fact that we prioritize our own interests and we don't want to take responsibility for others. But that just strikes me as that's what selfishness is. So could you tell me a bit more about why we've become like that? Like what's driving that change?
And again, I think that naturally humans are selfish creatures. And what civilization and society does is mitigate that that selfishness. And so that's why I think sort of an inward, individualistic focus, an idea that nobody else has responsibility over me and nobody else can claim my efforts and time. You could call that selfishness, but that's some of what I mean by autonomy. And obviously it's good and it's necessary in a certain amount. And we could get into a long thing about liberalism and, whether the god of liberalism failed. I think liberalism and those ideas of autonomy and consent and pluralism and toleration, they require what Tocqueville wrote about, which is communities and institutions which have a real sort of illiberal stain to them. They don't let everybody in. They kind of stick to you. They impose unchosen obligations on you. And we lost that latter part, which is exactly what Tocqueville predicted because he was a time traveler. But we lost the civil society aspect of it, and we kept the liberalism aspect of it. So these good, necessary ingredients of a healthy society are not being checked by the unchosen obligations, the little platoons, et cetera. That's what I mean.
Great. Tim, thanks for being here with us today. Everybody, give Tim a hand.